of the first peoples of Australia, dating back more than 60,000 years. Land never ceded, and pay my respects to Indigenous people attending here today. The AUKUS deal was dropped on us almost 4 years ago. IPAN is a network of many organisations that responded immediately to the announcement with a change.org petition, which is titled "No Nuclear Submarines, End US Dominance, Healthcare, Not Warfare." At the time, we had an immediate response by 20,000 people. The petition is still current. There are now 47,200 people have signed that petition. The AUKUS agreement is well known, largely due to the 38 billion tag associated with the submarines. However, the Force Posture Agreement signed in 2014 is less well known or understood. Today is the first day of the US war exercise Talisman Sabre. 35,000 personnel from 19 different countries operating in many parts of our country, enabled at one level or another by the Force Posture Agreement. Today's webinar launches a campaign initiated by IPAN, but in collaboration with many other organisations and individuals. And that is our aim, to have this as a very broad coalition of across the country. To use the 12-month cancellation clause in the two agreements to cancel both AUKUS and the Force Posture Agreement. With the two major parties in lockstep, we need a strong grassroots push to have any chance of achieving this outcome. In addition to your interest by attending today, we ask you to sign the call to cancel AUKUS and the Force Posture Agreement in the chat, and we'll repeat that throughout the webinar, and to share it widely. We will be in touch with each of you who have registered with a range of suggested ways in which you can take action, part of building that grassroots power that we do have. We are grateful to Mary, Doug, Mike and Kellie for their time and expertise, which they will share today. Mary Kostakidis, of course, needs no introduction to most of us. However, her journalism history is greatly respected, and we thank her for her incredible efforts working to inform Australians on the genocide happening right now in Gaza, despite the personal repercussions she is enduring. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Annette, and thank you for asking me to participate today. Our panel is going to discuss the important and very serious issues the petition focuses on and a rethink of our defence strategy. Does it enable Australia to assert our sovereignty? Do we have the freedom to act as a constructive force in our region for peace, security and prosperity for all, at a time when the alternative will likely land us in a war against China, one that much of the mainstream media supports, but not one I think the Australian public are keen on. As Anthony Albanese lands in China for a 6-day visit, the US Undersecretary for Defence is reportedly demanding Japan and Australia declare what we would do in the case of a war over Taiwan. We've seen the lawlessness and the absence of any moral compass operating in Gaza, supported by the United States, setting a precedent for what's permissible. So this is a critical time for Australians to say, these are not our values. This is not a strategy or alliance we wish to be a part of in the way that current arrangements force us to be, and in a war over here, as opposed to all the over there wars we've participated in. Our panel will provide 3 perspectives on the implications for Australia of our commitment to AUKUS, an agreement hatched in secret to spend close to $400 billion on a highly criticised submarine deal, and the Force Posture Agreement, which really turns Australia into yet another one of the many US bases where we don't have full knowledge of what arrives and departs from our soil, and we're bound to act in concert with the United States. Now the US is placing pressure on all its allies, including Australia, to increase our overall spending on defence. And at the same time, it's conducting its own review of AUKUS, a commitment the US was always going to have difficulty delivering on. On our panel today is Doug Cameron, who served as a Senator for New South Wales for more than a decade, was National Secretary of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union for 12 years, and Vice President of the ACTU. Retired Major General Mike Smith served for 34 years in the Australian Army. He's worked for the Australian Govt and the UN in a range of countries, including PNG, Timor-Leste, Libya and Yemen. He's a founding member of the Australia Peace and Security Forum and is eminently qualified to provide a view on Australia's national security issues and defence policy. Kellie Tranter is a lawyer, researcher and human rights activist. She's a patron of IPAN and chaired the IPAN People's Exploring the Case for an Independent and Peaceful Australia. She writes for independent publications, including Declassified Australia and Pearls and Irritations. Her latest revealing now, chartering our own course, there you go, including and her latest revealing the Australian government sent F-35 bomber parts directly to Israel as recently as last week, despite repeated denials. Now, during the discussion, please put your questions in the chat and I'll try and cover the issues that you raise in the Q&A later. We're planning to wrap up at 3:30 this afternoon, and after the discussion, Annette will have some very important things to say, so please stick around. Doug, I'd like to ask you to kick off with your remarks, because you come at this from the perspective of someone who has first-hand experience in the political process, including what happens behind closed doors, and also a union leader who has spearheaded campaigns to ensure Australian workers have a say. And we now face a situation where Australia may be dragged into a war against the very country that's been integral to our prosperity. Over to you.
Good. Thanks, Mary. And could I also acknowledge the traditional owners and thank IPAN for the opportunity to address this webinar. And for those of us who have been around a while, we would remember a guy called Kerry Packer. Kerry Packer gloated about taking Alan Bond to the cleaners. He said, "You only get one Alan Bond in your lifetime, and I've had mine," as he ruthlessly purchased Channel 9 for a bargain basement price. Unfortunately, Packer got it wrong, because the US and UK have had two Alan Bonds, Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese. What could have possessed two Australian Prime Ministers to enter into an arrangement to purchase horrendously expensive nuclear attack class submarines designed specifically for war against our largest and most important trading partner, China? I would not have expected much more from that fella down under. However, I would have expected so much more from Anthony Albanese. Morrison wedged Labour, and Labour collapsed within 24 hours. Like Malcolm Turnbull, I hope that the Trump administration saves us from ourselves by rejecting AUKUS or placing demands, as has been reported this morning, for more funding and a commitment to engage in war with China if the US determines to commence hostilities over Taiwan. I'm not confident that Trump will reject AUKUS. It's all upside for Trump. He has no obligation or need to look a gift horse in the mouth. He can keep receiving our tax dollars to fund his military-industrial complex with no commitment to ever deliver on the nuclear-powered subs. We should make it clear to the US that we will retain our sovereign right not to be caught up in a war with a major trading partner, and we should insist that we will not engage in a war over Taiwan. Trump is an authoritarian oligarch who is funding the genocide in Israel. Why would we continue to see that lot being close or good for Australia? It's just a nonsense. The Australian left, and certainly the Labour left, have always had a healthy and legitimate concern about warmongering and the approach of various US administrations. Why has the first left leader in modern times to attain the highest office in Australia abandoned his values and principles to cuddle up to a declining superpower who have demonstrated on too many occasions that militarism, power, and hegemony drive its relationship with the rest of the world? If a right-wing Labour Prime Minister such as Paul Keating had proposed an agreement that sacrificed our sovereignty to the United States with no guarantee that the $368 billion will ever result in receiving a submarine, there would have been a left-wing revolt. Thankfully, Paul Keating, Gareth Evans and Bob Carr have expressed their strong opposition to AUKUS. In my view, it's one of the dumbest military, diplomatic and economic decisions an Australian government has ever made. There are too many Labour politicians who have no experience of the implications for working class Australians in the event of a war. I myself have never had direct experience of war. I have been fortunate. I grew up in Scotland in the period following World War II, and I witnessed too many working class Scots who were on the front line returning home with physical and psychological trauma. This was a feature of post-World War II Britain in working class towns and cities around the country. My own father served as a sergeant major behind the Japanese lines in Burma with the British Expeditionary Forces, and he returned to regular bouts of malaria, alcoholism, and ill health. He died in his late 40s from a massive stroke. My experience and my family's experience was not an isolated situation for working class families following World War II. Every effort should be made to stop militarism and war. I am so disappointed in my party. We had the opportunity to undertake due diligence, critical analysis, and consultation within the party and with the public on the AUKUS agreement. Political expedience and an opportunity for political power triumphed over common sense. How could members of the parliamentary left timidly rule over in caucus? How could the Labour leadership within 24 hours capitulate to a Morrison wedge and then set out to enforce the decision on the ALP National Conference? I never thought that National Conference delegates who expressed genuine, legitimate concerns about AUKUS would be attacked on the conference floor by a left-wing minister parroting Ronald Reagan, who at this July 17th, 1980 Republican National Convention said the following, and I quote, "We know only too well that war comes not when the forces of freedom are strong, but when they are weak. It is then that tyrants are tempted." Labour Minister Pat Conroy morphed into an Antipodean clone of Ronald Reagan when he asserted, "Strength deters war, appeasement invites conflict." This is such a simplistic, stupid analysis. I expected more from Pat. In response to US Defence Secretary Peter Hegseth, who in May this year said, and I quote, "The region," and he's talking about the Indo-Pacific, "is America's priority theatre, and the threat posed by China is real and potentially imminent." Richard Marles described this as a very clear articulation of American intent, that what they seek is peace through strength. My goodness, the spirit of Ronald Reagan is alive and well in the Labour Party cabinet. We should stop using flawed, lazy and inept analysis and stop adopting right-wing rhetoric in defence of the indefensible. Marles has also described AUKUS as moving beyond interoperability to interchangeability and ensuring that we have the enablers in place to operate seamlessly together at speed. What has happened to my party? Who are we going to operate at speed against? It is only China. Simon Crean, in a courageous speech as leader of the party to the National Press Club in Canberra on March the 20th, 2003, opposed Howard sending troops to Iraq. Simon gave 3 assurances to the Australian people. He said if he was Prime Minister, he would never follow a policy determined by another country. Secondly, he said he would never commit to an unnecessary war while peace is possible. And thirdly, he said he would never send Australia's young men and women to war without telling them the truth. These are principles that should be adopted by the Albanese government. Where are the Labour parliamentary forces for peace? And why is there no demand for accountability, transparency and sovereignty as we capitulate to fear, militarism, the Trump regime and the US and UK military industrial complex? Gone are the days when the Labour left forced Bob Hawke to retreat from allowing the Reagan administration to test MX missiles and have them land off the coast of Tasmania. Gone are the days where members of Parliament in the House of Representatives and Senate defied the government about sending our forces to the Gulf War. Gone are the days when strong, committed and principled members and senators from the left parliamentary faction, including Jeanette McHugh, Carolyn Jacobson, Elaine Darling, Frank Walker, Stuart West, Peter Duncan, John Scott, and Senators Bruce Childs, John Coates and Margaret Reynolds refused to abandon their moral convictions. What has happened to the spirit of Tom Uren? Tom was Albo's mentor. He was a tough heavyweight boxer who survived years in Japanese prison camps and emerged as an iconic leader of the Labour parliamentary left and the Australian peace movement. I remember marching for peace with Tom Uren at Palm Sunday peace marches in Sydney. Current members of the Labour caucus who are silent on AUKUS marched with Tom, the trade union movement, faith groups and the community. Peace now plays second fiddle to parliamentary power, government benches and ministerial perks. There are many military strategists who have analysed the relative strength of the US and Chinese military. There is a growing consensus that the US could not defeat China if war breaks out between these two superpowers. The US ignores peace through its military interventions in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran. It has no chance of maintaining peace through strength and has no chance of defeating a determined nuclear-armed China. As Malcolm Fraser outlined in his book, Dangerous Allies, Australia faces the situation of a defeated US administration retreating back to America and leaving Australia as a defeated ally in the Asia Pacific. If you cannot comprehensively defeat Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, or Iran, there is no chance that China will be defeated, and there is more chance that our use of nuclear-powered attack submarines off the coast of China could result in a nuclear conflict between China and the US. This decision leaves targets such as Perth, Newcastle, Wollongong, Adelaide, and our various military establishments as nuclear targets in a war between the US and China. I am not a pacifist, and I'm not prone to arguing for appeasement towards China. We must, as the Crean Principles outline, avoid war while peace is possible. There is an obligation to defend Australia, and that could be achieved by scrapping AUKUS and moving rapidly to an echidna strategy as advocated by Sam Roggeveen. This would be a defensive strategy that avoids the stupidity of basing nuclear-powered submarines off the coast of mainland China. It would be expensive, but it would avoid a loss of sovereignty and the inevitability of forward deploying Australian nuclear-powered submarines against China. The Athenian general Thucydides, I knew I was going to stuff that up, in 416 BCE said, and I quote, "In many cases, men have been able to see the dangers ahead of them, but they have surrendered to an idea that seduced them into an irrevocable disaster by their own folly rather than by their misfortune. This is so true today." In his book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? Graham Allison, Dean of the Kennedy School of Government, calls for the US to pivot to a new strategy for its rivalry with China. He calls for a serious pause for reflection. Nothing could be more important than the Australian government taking a serious pause for reflection on AUKUS and the Forced Posture Agreement. We should stop acting like a sub-imperial power to the United States, proclaim our independence, exercise our sovereignty, and become a force for peace, not war. We should reject war with China over Taiwan. We should adopt what Gareth Evans and Simon Crean have laid out as principles. Gareth Evans said recently, there should be less America, more self-reliance, more Asia, more global engagement. I thank IPAN for the opportunity to speak today. I call on an ongoing approach that we educate, we organise, and we seek to control the outcomes when it comes to AUKUS and the force posture. We should demand parliamentarians support peace, not war. The days of US hegemony and primacy are over. We should extricate ourselves from a sycophantic support for the US and for the worst president ever in the case of the US, Donald Trump. Exercise sovereignty, fight for peace, and stop this nonsense. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for all of the amazing points you made, and for telling it like it is, because in the press we're getting this testosterone-fueled boys' own military adventure approach to a war with China. And you're focusing on what the cost is going to be to Australia, to our security, and to the people who are actually going to pay with their lives. Mike, I'm very interested in hearing your remarks on how adequate our current arrangements are in guaranteeing our security. Doug talked about a defensive approach to security, and what could take the place of what we have now.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I'll cover that. And thanks, Doug, for a great talk and some good advice. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians, and I'm currently in Ngunnawal and Ngambie land, and of course it's the end of the 50th anniversary of NAIDOC Week as we're speaking. So I'd like to thank IPAN. I think it's a very important and a very timely topic, and not only because of the increasing global uncertainties that are all around us, but also because Prime Minister Albanese is visiting China as we speak. I think we're all waiting to see what might come out of that visit. Probably not what some of us would wish. But this webinar is also very timely because everyone agrees that the most important responsibility of government and of all elected parliamentarians is to enhance, or at least try and enhance, the security of our citizens. And this requires a national conversation. But unfortunately, our current government, and certainly its predecessor, is not particularly interested in national conversations about national security issues. They are about other things. I mean, our Treasurer talks all the time about conversation on this and a conversation on that, and we need to find out what everybody wants. But on national security, it's done behind closed doors and people are informed. And our parliamentarians, most of them, don't seem to be that interested either. It is really quite surprising, I think, and alarming given the geopolitical circumstances that we face. Now, I want to make one central point as a key takeaway for everyone, and I want to elaborate on this central point by highlighting two important related issues, and that will include what you asked me at the start, Mary. The first important point is the changed and changing geopolitical circumstances which Australia faces. We tend to talk a lot about China and the US, but we don't seem to understand the situation that we now face. And the second is the very urgent need for us to recalibrate our alliance with the US. And unlike some people probably appearing today, I don't think it's realistic to say we won't have an alliance with the US, but we certainly need to recalibrate it. And I'll talk about that. My key message and my central takeaway that I want to make is that Australia urgently needs a comprehensive national peace and security strategy. And despite the increasing deterioration in security globally, we have not had a national security strategy since 2013. And even that document was not particularly comprehensive, but it was a good start. Now, by comprehensive, I don't mean a defence strategy. And particularly, I don't want a defence strategy that masquerades as a de facto national security strategy, because we don't have one. So a defence strategy must support a national security strategy, not replace or misalign security priorities. Many countries have national security strategies. I just don't understand why we don't. All of our closest partners have them, I must say. Now, at the Australian Peace and Security Forum, we suggest 4 major interacting pillars for this strategy: economic security, regional security, climate security, and human security. And these provide a good start point. Each of these pillars has subsidiary elements which we have highlighted. Domestic, regional, and global factors need to be considered in each of these pillars. Now, importantly, this national peace and security strategy must be based on and preceded by a national risk assessment. And some countries actually do this. They actually do a risk assessment of what's out there, and then they write their national security strategy. That'd be novel, wouldn't it, to do that? As you know, as a military person, I come from the need for planning, but I don't see much of it around. Now, clearly, and this is very important, both the national risk assessment and the national peace and security strategy must be delivered in full consultation with the Australian Parliament and the Australian people. And this is where the role of civil society, I think, is vital in our democracy, and this is what we should be calling for. Now, unlike most national security strategies that I've read, I think we should call ours a peace and national security, because by putting that word in, it focuses on what Doug was actually saying, that the end statement of everything we want to do should be to try and preserve peace and enhance peace. And by putting that in the title, I think that focuses. Now, completing these 2 documents I talked about will take some time, and particularly for the consultation. And in our rapidly changing world, however, key decisions will need to be taken in advance. And I'll cover some of these in my next 2 points. But our national security depends critically on understanding and accepting the changed and challenging and changing geopolitical circumstances in the real world. Now, we mightn't like these circumstances, but we have to shape them as best we can to assure the security and prosperity of the Australian people. We now live in an increasingly multipolar world. Hedley Bull's anarchical society has returned to its preeminence position, and it's returned with a vengeance. The balance of power is shifting from west to east and influence from north to south. The curtain has descended on over 2 centuries of Western dominance. This doesn't mean the West is irrelevant, but it does not any longer have the influence it once had. China is now the major power in Asia. Not becoming, it is the major power in Asia. Australia's future is as part of Asia. The so-called rules-based international order is evaporating, and more so because of US policies. Sadly, the UN is becoming increasingly irrelevant and may not even survive if the US withdraws totally from it or fails to pay its dues. What a terrible thought, but this is reality. The US and China are locked in a power struggle, and smart governments around the world are hedging their bets. Whether we like it or not, the trend for most of these countries is more towards China, as trust in the US continues to decline and China continues to expand its economic reach. The US continues to be a major power and will continue to be a major power, and the predominant military power in the world. But its America First approach is unsettling, and its mantra of "Make America Great Again" actually confirms that it is no longer as great as it once was. So that's the reality. And unfortunately, in a highly conflicted US political landscape, the anti-China card is one of the few unifying realities. And this does not bode well for future peace. At a time when the world should be uniting to counter climate disruption, avoid nuclear war, achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and mitigate the threat of future pandemics, we seem to be heading in the opposite direction. Instead, we wake up each morning to hear more bad news and the latest tweet from the leader of the free world. In this pessimistic environment, one thing is certain. The worst possible outcome for Australia is war between China and the US, in which we become involved and, most likely, would suffer collateral damage. By contrast, unless the nuclear threshold was breached or reached, it is most unlikely that continental United States would be targeted at all. So this leads me to my second point, the urgent need for Australia to recalibrate its alliance with the US. Now, in thinking about this, I immediately think of what Foreign Minister Penny Wong said some time ago, which has now become the mantra for all Labor politicians. On China, we must cooperate where we can, disagree where we must, and manage our differences wisely. Except I think that quote is more applicable to our relationship with the United States. Because if we have an ally, shouldn't we be able to do that with our ally? But instead of that, we have really, as I think it was Paul Keating said, surrendered our sovereignty and have the boots hanging out of their backside. Our boots, that is. Now, I was encouraged, however, by Prime Minister Albanese's recent John Curtin address. It provided me with some optimism. He talked about and emphasised the need for Australia to have an independent foreign policy, for us to make our own decisions. I just wonder how far that'll go in Washington and how far we're prepared to take it in Washington. So what are some of the decisions that have to be taken pretty darn quickly, in my view? And this relates to your question earlier, Mary. The first thing that we can do, we just can't cancel AUKUS, but what we need to do immediately is have a proper, transparent review of AUKUS to find out if this is really what the Australian public want. Because we haven't had a review, and I'm sick and tired of hearing the Deputy Prime Minister and other ministers say that we've done a review on AUKUS, because we haven't. We haven't done a review on AUKUS at all. Now, the Brits have, and the US is doing a review, but we haven't done one. I think any sensible review that's undertaken will show that this is not in Australia's interests. In fact, it actually threatens our security. This issue of deterrence, by the time we get our submarines, we'll be in another era. And submarines could well be have lost their current stealth capability. But moreover, these submarines are not fit for purpose for Australian defence. And so, answering your question, Mary, we can easily defend Australian territory, easily, but not if we undertake the sort of strategy that was in this Defence Strategic Review, which assigns us to a role which is really subordinate to the US. And we don't want to get into that contest. But as Sam Roggeveen, as Hugh White, and as a myriad of other, including myself, have pointed out, we can defend Australia. So that one thing is review AUKUS. We also urgently have to review the Force Posture Agreement, because most Australians have no idea of what that involves, and even I, who know something about it, don't know the details. So if we're going to have an agreement with another country, then we need to clear up with the Australian and fess up to the Australian people what that entails. And we haven't, and the government hasn't done that yet. And when we ask about questions, well, what does this establishment do? We're not given the answers. So we need to review it. I think I agree with Doug in that the Australian government needs to have the guts to say, we're not going to war with China over Taiwan. Taiwan is not one of our vital interests. And we shouldn't go to war, and we won't go to war with China unless we're absolutely threatened to go to war with China. This means we need to withdraw military assets from the South China Sea, where so-called freedom of navigation operations are likely to cause a major conflict. And Australia's already had a couple of close calls there. And of course, we're told in Australia, this is because China's acting aggressively to us. We're not told what it is that Australia's doing in those waters at the time. So I think that we should declare this as a policy that we have no intention of going to war with China. It makes no sense to go to war with our major trading partner unless we were threatened by them. It makes no sense to talk about freedom of navigation when the largest merchant marine in the world is Chinese, when the Chinese economy depends on freedom of navigation. And China has signed on to UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Sea. America hasn't. So freedom of navigation then raises this question: whose freedom of navigation and for what? China has not restricted any navigation in the South China Sea and doesn't want to. What it objects to is military activities in that contested area. And our role to the South China Sea question should be totally diplomatic. We're not one of the players. We're not one of the contestants. We may or may not agree with different sides on it, but they've been dealing with that reasonably peacefully. And the outcome of that is still to be totally determined. Most importantly, within our immediate region, we need to work with our near neighbours, as far more so than we have been doing, to assure this area to our north remains nuclear-free and a nuclear-free zone of peace. That's what our neighbours want. That's what we should want. And we shouldn't even consider nuclear-powered submarines transiting that area. You know, the countries in that area in World War II never invited war on their soil and in their waters, and they were the most impacted by it. They're now independent countries. They still suffer from the remnants of unexploded ordnance right through that area. It's never been cleared up. There haven't even been surveys done of where this stuff is. And so we want to make this area a peaceful part of the world, and we can show leadership in that by showing that. If we don't threaten any other country, why would somebody threaten us? That doesn't mean to say, that's not appeasement. That's saying we will have a strong defence force, and if you try and threaten us, we will retaliate, and you won't succeed. There is no way that America could defeat China now in a war over Taiwan. Impossible. And that's why China has developed the military the way it has. And I haven't seen any evidence of China being a belligerent state. I haven't seen them establish 800 plus military bases around the world. In fact, I think they've got one in Djibouti. Yeah, it doesn't mean to say some of their other maritime bases couldn't be dual purpose, that they possibly could. And one final thing about our nearer region, which I get a bit hot under the collar about, it's working with our neighbours in the nearer region. We should stop competing with China. This is an area that we need to help bring out of poverty. This is an area that needs huge infrastructure development. And if China can assist in that area, we should welcome it. In fact, we should work with them through the countries to see what those countries want to do. Instead of that, it's always pitched as a contest between us and China to curry favour. We are the partner of choice, I hear. Well, partners of choice become partners of choice, not by our saying, but by their saying. And countries in the Pacific need to say what they want, and we need to help them get it. And most important thing is bring them out of poverty and achieve the sustainable development goals. So I've said quite a lot today in my 10 minutes or so, but I think I'll leave it there and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mike. You've certainly covered a lot of ground there, and thank you for presenting an alternative vision of what our peace and security and defence strategy could be. I mean, John Mearsheimer has, and everyone has heard this quote from John Mearsheimer, that if there's one thing worse than an enemy of the United States, it's being a friend. And whether the Australian government can continue to be a friend but stand up to the United States remains to be seen. Thank you also for pointing out this mantra, the freedom of navigation that we keep hearing in the press all the time. It really is being repeated to convince the public. But it's disappointing that to think that either journalists are unaware of the reality of the situation or are aware of it and are doing this regardless. Kellie, I'm very keen to hear your perspective as a human rights and anti-war advocate and someone who is across Australia's obligations under international law. So over to you now.
Thank you, Mary. I would like to begin also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and in my case, that's the Wonnawurrung people. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Australia is a nation founded on genocide, and we must continue to make amends and implement broad redress measures. I'd like to thank IPAN for its exhaustive efforts in the defence and foreign policy space to change the current trajectory on a limited budget. I'd also like to acknowledge the courage and stoicism of moderator Mary Kostakidis, who has been the target of vexatious, mischievous, costly litigation, and yet has found the time to be with us this afternoon. Please donate what you can to her court challenge. And finally, my thanks to former Labor Senator Doug Cameron and retired Major General Michael Smith for contributing their informed thoughts and ideas to this discussion. The topic of this webinar is Cancel AUKUS, Rethink Defence, Assert Independence. And I have been asked to discuss why the Forced Posture Agreement 2014 and the AUKUS Agreement, which has never been publicly released, should be scrapped. Also kept secret is Dennis Richardson's AUKUS review findings of the submarine agency, as opposed to a comprehensive review, Although they will both remain secret, he reportedly told Miles that the government and defence need to do a better job selling AUKUS's merits to the Australian public, warning that its social licence was under threat. As I always say, and I am acutely aware that many of those who are watching and listening have far more experience than I about this matter. So please don't regard my comments as expert comments. Force posture agreement. In 2023, I stated publicly that the combined effect of the force posture agreement and other defence agreements with the United States is to nullify Australia's capacity to make independent decisions about war avoidance and war fighting. Together, they lock us into providing the United States first with secured areas under its control from which it may conduct a war, and second, with comprehensive logistical support for any such folly. It must be remembered that when the Force Posture Agreement was signed in 2014, it was an Abbott government in Canberra and an Obama administration in the White House. The Obama administration had publicly commenced its pivot to Asia. Obama addressed the Australian Parliament. He was the first and only US president to visit Darwin. And according to a May 2014 Roy Morgan survey, he was the most admired public figure in Australia. Despite the fact that he championed drone strikes outside of declared battlefields, throughout his charm offensive in Australia, he regularly referred to peace, security, international laws and norms, and still spoke of the ANZUS Treaty, wherein the parties undertake as set forth in the Charter of the UN to settle any international disputes in which they are involved by peaceful means. No one talks about ANZUS anymore. Notwithstanding that, no secret was made of the fact that the Force Posture Agreement was all about providing the United States with additional reach in the Asia-Pacific region, and Barack Obama said as much in a doorstop with Tony Abbott. Under an Obama administration, there seemed little cause for concern because he presented as a considered president who respected international institutions. Over a decade later, with the onslaught of Trump's second term, public opinion has shifted. Over a decade later, a June Lowy Institute poll showed that only 36% of Australians have any faith the US will act responsibly in the world, a 20% drop. A YouGov poll revealed that 2/3 of Australians say the US can't be trusted as a security ally and want to develop a more independent defence capacity. Other polls are showing that half of Australians are not at all confident Trump would defend Australia's interests if threatened, and that Trump is the greatest threat to world peace. Many Australians thus are rightfully concerned that the United States now has a lunatic in the cockpit. Many Australians realise that there's nothing you can say to persuade him. There's no hope of educating him. He doesn't create any space for rational, fact-based dialogue. He doesn't read, and he doesn't listen, except to those who say what he wants to hear. In this mess, the Australian government seems to think that they just have to wait it out and some sort of normality will be restored at the end of Trump's reign in 2026. That's why our government addresses legitimate concerns about the reliability of the United States under a Trump presidency with lines like, the US-Australia alliance is far bigger than any prime minister or any president. This approach ignores the fact that the Trump organization is selling Trump 2028 caps, and that serious consideration is being given to challenging the US Constitution so Trump can stay in power through succession rather than election. Trump is not a man that would treat the US Constitution as an absolute. Now to AUKUS. a critical geopolitical agreement still unseen by the Australian public. Australia has already handed $800 million to the United States government, possibly irrecoverable, with the prospect that a current Trump administration review may change the terms of the agreement, including a guarantee that Australia will use the subs to support the US in any conflict over Taiwan, or renege on the deal completely. AUKUS was never about our acquisition of nuclear submarines to enhance Australia's security. It is a catchy acronym used to cover our ex-politicians being personally enriched and the United States being permitted to totally militarize Northern Australia, to enhance its position in its Indo-Pacific zone of confrontation by basing and increasing the size of its forces and materiel, and provide a place from which it can intimidate and, if necessary, carry out offensive operations against China. And now it's being used as a tool to hold our nation to ransom. US military facilities in Australia have expanded as required by the US government for basing of their troops, military assets and equipment. They already have under strict US control fuel storage tanks, maintenance facilities, ammunition bunkers, rotations of aircraft, including bombers, accommodation, spaceports, advanced intelligence gathering facilities, telescopes, radars, launch pads for rockets, airstrips, parking facilities for major aircraft tankers, and a joint command centre in Darwin to run the whole show. The Squadron Operations Facility in Darwin, a United States Air Force Mission Planning and Operations Centre. So the stage is set for an unabashed international bully to use our country to threaten other people of the world. At the moment, China, with weapons that have the capacity to inflict mass destruction and facilitate the death of an unquantifiable number of innocent men, women, and children, and attract a proportionate retaliation. The protective effect for us, it makes us all, not just those living in Northern Australia, potential military targets. And where does that leave us? Sadly, we have become used to the chaos of a world devoid of international morality or compliance with international law. Our great ally has weakened and undermined our international institutions and the mechanisms for peace, and its cancerous military-industrial complex has infiltrated our political and financial systems. Corrupt elites in both places are rewarded and shielded by governments, while advocates for peace, transparency and justice, people like Mary, are increasingly repressed and criminalised. There is no incentive for nations entangled through defence interoperability and interchangeability to take action. Too many benefit from the spoils, and those who resist are bribed, bullied, blackmailed, or punished. How many times have we heard Trump say, "We hold all the cards"? Why else has the Australian government fallen eerily silent on the issue of genocide, awkwardly attempted to justify the illegal bombing of Iran by our ally, and failed to disclose when asked whether facilities on our mainland enabled America's force projection, and supported a military operation in Yemen not authorised by the UN Security Council, which jeopardised the peace and stability of the entire Middle East? Our children are witnessing how wars are being fought now, including my own. And in the future, with lawlessness, with mechanised brutality, remotely and anonymously, and without limitations. I can only imagine what Australia's young boys and girls think when they hear the media-facilitated push for even more defence spending and calls for conscription to be considered if Australia faces a recruitment crisis and a major conflict. Particularly when children pay the highest price in war, with currently 473 million children, or more than 1 in 6 children globally, living in or fleeing conflicts, of which there are 56 active conflicts, the highest number since World War II. This is why IPAN's initiative is sound and must be sustained. Sustainability is the key. AUKUS and the Forced Posture Agreement must be scrapped. The US is far too aggressive and confrontational, and if we are locked into its decisions and actions, then we'll have no off-ramp from any military folly it might embark upon or foment. In short, I think Malcolm Fraser, that Dog referred to his book, Dangerous Allies, he said, we have no capacity to say no. We have no option as it stands to stay out of it. But there are glimmers of hope. IPAN has already commenced calls for Australia to adopt a non-nuclear armed neutrality. Dr. Pascal Lotez, researcher in neutrality studies, has articulated the need to convince our political leadership to start using the rhetoric of neutrality to make non-alignment official policy, to legislate that Australia's foreign policy is one of neutrality, and to seek recognition from third-party states of Australia's neutrality. There may be an educational and cultural hurdle to overcome, given that most Australians, unfortunately, still believe the Australia-US alliance is important to our security. But this hurdle may progressively evaporate the longer Trump remains in the White House. Consultations need to take place with experts from non-aligned countries. Costings must be done to determine how much needs to be spent on defence in a non-aligned position and released publicly for comparison and informed debate. And hopefully a consensus can be reached, which will help make it all happen. Remarks about following our own course and shaping our own future made recently by the Prime Minister in his John Curtin oration may only have been intended to send a message to an ally threatening tariffs, but they've raised the issue of Australia having a genuine ambition to adopt an independent foreign policy and defence position. Even though there's a yawning gap between the words and actions of most politicians and hypocrisy, the Prime Minister's statements should be publicly commended. They should be shared, and they should be used by IPAN to achieve its goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Kellie. Well, in your characteristic way, you've described the gravity of our situation, and in the fact that we're tied to our major ally, who is so aggressive and so confrontational. We seem to be in a very volatile period at the moment, a tussle between a hegemon upping the ante to show that might is right and international law only applies to those deemed our enemies, and new alliances attempting to reshape the dynamic in a multipolar world. So, Kellie, if I could ask you to begin with, do you get any hope from these alternative alliances, these new alliances? Can they help us reimagine our future and conduct within a framework that may function in a more democratic and constructive way? I think earlier Mike referred to the demise of the United Nations, and really whether it is going to completely disintegrate or function in this very increasingly dysfunctional way. We need something to replace that. And where do we look to for a model, if you like, of a new way of behaving in the world and having agency?
Thanks, Barry. I mean, there's a lot in what you say. It's something that I often think about too. But what is fortunate is that we already have the mechanisms for peace that were established after World War II. What is happening is they're being undermined. The good news is that there are a lot of organizations like IPAN globally who are trying to consider where the opportunities are for ad hoc multilateralism. So the more the United States withdraws, that's going to create an opening. Trump, as irrational as he sometimes seems, he does tend to make decisions that are against sort of the normal diplomatic norms. So he will talk to the North Korean leader, or he'll talk to Putin, where others, don't want to have that sort of dialogue. But the problem with Trump's approach is that it is very ad hoc. So because of Trump's behavior, his aggressive behavior and the bullying, we now need to throw our support around the stability of the ad hoc multilateral groupings that are now taking place in a sustainable way. It has to be sustained rather than just one-offs. We have to call for UN Security Council reform. That's already there, but it's not working. It's sort of limping along. It's losing its effectiveness and its legitimacy. We've seen that in Gaza, where the United States votes against a ceasefire, and that's where it ceases to be debated. So there's also the people-to-people connections. Again, IPAN is important in this. From country to country, we've got to have people on the ground enhancing understanding. We need to use what our politicians say, not against them, but we need to support them. I think Albanese is in a bit of a bind. I think it's great that he's in China, for instance, because the economic relationship gives us, it's a cause for stability. Having a relationship with China can kind of keep things steady in terms of this region. But we need to support the Prime Minister where he, I think he is hinting at trying to be more independent in his thinking. And that's what we have to latch onto so that we facilitate him going down that path. Like, his speech refers to getting inspiration from the Australian people. And I think that's, an important point to grasp and run with. We need to support the Global South in its leadership in upholding international law. The Global South really is key, I think, in terms of their historical treatment. But we've got South Africa lodging it's lodged its case, for instance, in the matter of Palestine and in Israel. Creating economic ties in our region gives us a shared incentive for stability. We've got to have procedures for conflict resolution, platforms for radical disengagement, so places where people can come and thrash things out, and even if they disagree, but again, it enhances understanding. We have to have an increase in regionalisation, and I think we'll be forced to do that as Trump withdraws, the United States becomes a little bit more isolated in its thinking, which is where Michael's work feeds in, I think, having that regional approach.
Yes. If I could just bring Mike in, actually, I wanted to ask you how our current arrangements and behaviour that is engaging in this activity up and down the coast of China with the US are viewed in the region. I know your organisation held an event the other day with Kishore Mahbubani, so you'd have the latest feedback from the region, I imagine.
Well, on that issue, Kishore has explained countless times that, in his opinion, the South China Sea issue is best left to be resolved by the participating or contesting parties concerned. And when people immediately go to China and say, look at what they're doing, you know, they're taking these little atolls and militarizing them and all the rest of it. As Kishore has pointed out, yes, well, they did that because because other countries did it first. And those other countries, namely the Philippines, were actually encouraged to do it. So, so this is a dispute. But look, in the issue of, you know, China versus the Philippines over the Philippines contested area, I mean, I did see the Chinese Coast Guard use water cannons. I don't think America would ever consider using water cannons in a dispute. So, so this thing needs to be resolved as best it can by those parties who all claim territorial sovereignty in that area. We're not one of those parties, right? And nor is America one of those parties. So we should stay out of it. I think, though, probably Kishore's bigger advice, because he has written some articles going back several years now to what Australia, you know, should be doing about this US-China thing. And he has repeatedly said that we should work more closely with ASEAN and we should encourage ASEAN rather than criticising ASEAN, which we have a tendency to do in Australia. We tend to say, oh, yes, ASEAN's fine, but look, they don't resolve disputes. Well, more importantly, they haven't been fighting each other. And ASEAN has been relatively peaceful in terms of interstate warfare. And of course, they do abide by that business of not getting involved in another country's internal affairs. It would pay for Australia to you know, praise ASEAN for that success. They also are much more adept at working with China than we are. And we can, I mean, if China is a big threat, you would think that all these countries would be so worried about this, you know, and countries that border on China or close to China, like Vietnam, you know, they seem to be able to manage their relationship much better. So
the question is really, it's a threat to US security. They've made that clear. US economic security. Is it a threat to our economic security? And I think the answer, you know, that everyone's giving is no, it isn't. We ought to be able to engage with them in a way that doesn't involve going to war.
yeah, yeah. Well, we're caught in that difficult dilemma of our so-called security protector, the United States, is in contest, a large contest, with our greatest economic benefactor, if you like, you know, and that we have to choose sides, you know. So I don't think we should be choosing sides. I think we should be managing both these relationships as best we can and not putting ourselves into a situation where we do have to inadvertently, or because I mean, look, AUKUS submarines, there is no way those submarines are going to be used unless that they are used the way the United States wants them to be used. So when the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister talks about, no, they will be our sovereign assets, forget it. They won't be our sovereign assets at all, because they don't work that way.
And they're going to be used, they're intended to be used to go to war for the United States' economic interests.
Yeah, correct. Absolutely right. Yeah. Now, what we haven't spoken about today, which is pretty important, and why we think in APSF economic security is a big issue. I mean, economic security at home, but economic security globally, is we don't hear much in Australia about what the rest of the world is doing, you know, like in BRICS Plus and de-dollarization and trading in currencies other than, because, you know, I mean, the American national debt is really sustained because of the US dollar being, but as more countries move away from that, then we've got to say, well, where will that place the US? And I was really pleased Doug raised the Thucydides trap, because a lot of people don't like using it, but I think it's a very real situation that if America feels that it is going to become number two, it won't accept it. You know, I mean, you mentioned John Mearsheimer. He says all the time that, you know, America is number one, and nobody can take them on. And if they do, they'll you know, and you know. Anyway.
Yeah, but if I could bring Doug in at this point, because I'd like to ask you, Doug, whether you think that after what happened to Gough Whitlam and after all the regime change operations that we've seen around the world, will any leader here of any persuasion have the courage to say to the United States, thanks, but no thanks, we're going to do this our way?
Well, Mary, I hope so, but how can you be sure? I agree that there are some small areas that we should welcome in the curtain speech by Anthony Albanese. I'm very critical of the party leadership as to where it's at, but there seems to be this fundamental position that Labour cannot survive if there's disagreement within the parliamentary party. I'm sure the first caucus meeting before Parliament will, you know, members will get a lecture about solidarity and, you know, cohesion and making sure that, you know, we don't open ourselves up to any criticism. That's all fine. But when you've got such a fundamental issue as, you know, the reality that we could end up in a war with our biggest trading partner, then I think realism, debate, discussion, education is absolutely essential. I don't see on the horizon any leader within the party who will overtly take Trump on, but I am hopeful that with more organisation, more campaigning in the general community, more pushback from organisations like Labour Against War, of which I'm a patron, that we do get this movement from just anything goes, the US can do what it likes. That is going to be the big test of a Labour government into the future.
Indeed, thank you very much, Doug. I think this is a good point to hand over now to Annette to wrap up. I know she has some very important things to communicate to you, so please don't go away before she does. And I want to give my thanks to IPAN and thanks to the panel for their inspirational and very realistic appraisal of the situation that we find ourselves in, and a vision for what needs to happen to take us into a future that doesn't involve us putting our children and our grandchildren at great risk. So over to you, Annette.
Well, thank you very much.
Get the
Mary.
video back for me.
Yeah, I think there's somebody just interjected there. So thank you very much, Mary, for doing such a great job of facilitating this webinar. wow, been some really fabulous stuff come out from each of the three speakers. Some standouts for me were, the frequent emphasis on Australia not wanting to go to war in a dispute or a war between the United States and China. The importance of neutrality coming into the discourse within Australia. And I've mentioned in the chat that the Pacific Peace Network that IPAN plays a significant role in has a petition going out across the Pacific nations, hoping to get as many signatures as possible for people to sign on to declare that your country will be neutral in the event that it's getting closer or a war is started between the United States and China. The importance of independence for Australia, and I think that's starting to resonate. We've really going through a process where Australians are really starting to identify as a nation that is not an appendage of the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, in so many ways, we are an appendage of the United States and from the United Kingdom, but the kernel of thinking about the need for us to stand in the region that we live in as an independent nation, making our own decisions and making those decisions in the interests of peace, no war, and relationships with the people of this region that we live in, getting to know each other. The best security, in fact, is to know your neighbours. Unfortunately, under John Howard, the whole process, the programs in education where we had children learning languages from the region that we live in, Indonesian, Japanese, Chinese, that was all shelved under that dreadful dark period under John Howard. This is really important in our view from IPAN that we do develop these stronger, deeper relationships with the people of the region in which we live. And one of the huge things that we haven't talked much about today are the existential challenges that are faced to people around the world, but in particular to people of the Pacific living in low-lying islands, of climate change, of rising sea levels. If we're going to talk about security, we cannot avoid the threats to security that climate change poses to people around the world. So one of the reasons why we've had this launch of the campaign to see AUKUS and the forced posture agreements cancelled, and I take on board Mike's point that we're not going to see it cancelled kind of just out of the blue, even with the 12-month clause in the agreements that say Australia can declare that in 12 months' time we want out. But that will only happen if there's been significant debate in the community, if each and every one of us here today has the discussions with our friends, our families, our organisations that we are part of outside of political groups and peace groups. And that's the only way that I think, and IPAN thinks, that it will happen. So I just wanted to outline really what is in the call. And this is one of the things we've asked you here today, is to sign the call to end AUKUS and the forced posture agreement and to share it. It's been in the chat, but we'll certainly reinforce this when we get in touch with you post-webinar. So the public call is for the Australian Government to cancel the AUKUS and forced posture agreement in order that we stop nuclear submarines using Australian ports, nuclear submarine waste being stored on Australian territory, nuclear-capable bombers operating from Australia, the use of Australian territory as a base for US war preparations, Australian territories becoming military targets. So they're the things that really we're asking our government, the reason why we want these agreements cancelled. Are there any questions just at this point before we're almost ready to finish up? Just put your hand up if there are.
Actually, there are quite a few questions. I thought we were running out of time. If you'd like me to
I think
Do you want me
specifically
to?
about the petition and the campaign, Mary, is what really.
Sorry,
If you have any
no, sorry. Yep.
questions about the campaign that IPAN has initiated, but it doesn't belong to IPAN. But we've reached the end of our 1.5 hours, so I won't delay. But I'd like to thank, in particular, our presenters. Kellie Tranter, we've had a long association with you now, Kellie, coming on board to run that massive exercise that IPAN ran, the inquiry into Australia's role in supporting US wars. Kellie has agreed, and we're very grateful for her to acting as a patron of IPAN, along with Ian Lowe, our 2 patrons. So thank you very much, Kellie, again, for making the time today in your busy life. To Doug and the work that Doug and others are doing in Labour Against War, a huge thank you for being here today. That is such an important part of building this grassroots campaign to change course, to see Australia take off in a very long awaited course for a responsible and respected and peace-loving nation in our region. To Mike, coming from your background and the work that you've done in the years that I've known you on what is really about security. And it's not just military, it's about all the things that you talked about. To Mary, thanks again so much. You've been a great facilitator, and I hope that we might continue to work with you in many capacities, not just as a facilitator, but the work that you do and the commitment that you have for humanity. Because when we think about Gaza, it's about humanity. It's about the children. And we cannot let that sort of war continue. We cannot let that sort of war be started anywhere else in the world. So thanks to everybody for coming along today, and look out for an email from us in IPAN in the near future. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
If the